This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
In the untouched regions of the forest, the kōkako runs through the treetops feeding on leaves, flowers and fruit. The South Island kōkako, with its distinctive orange wattles at the base of the bill, hasn't been sighted in many years and may be extinct. A situation the blue-wattled bird of the North Island may find itself in unless its habitat is preserved. Its delightful call includes a variety of rich organ and bell-like notes.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.nz.
Good morning, friends. Today we have with us Nathan Surendran.
Yeah.
And you're the chairperson of the Wise Response Society, which is an environmental and climate change group, as I understand it. And go ahead.
Can I correct you on that? Sorry, because so Wise Response is a incorporated society, and our primary question is, as demand for growth exceeds Earth's physical limits, causing unprecedented risks, what knowledge and actions do we need to secure New Zealand's future well-being? So just that's our sort of mission statement, if you like.
Okay, that's good. Clear that up. And you can podcast this by going to oar.org.nz and then going to podcast and going to Community or Chaos. And welcome to Community or Chaos. Hopefully more community, less chaos.
Let's hope so, yes.
Matthew, what brought you to take part in Wise Response Society? It's been around for a while. It was localized in Otago at one point.
Correct, yeah. So the majority of our committee are still Otago-based. I'm personally based in Southland. I've got a background as a energy systems engineer, specifically building energy systems, HVAC systems design, building physics, the dynamic thermal simulation of energy flows in buildings. And around the time of the GFC in 2008, 2009, I got made redundant at one point and started reading, which is always a dangerous thing to do, and cottoned on to the bigger story of, I guess, what's known broadly as the meta-crisis or polycrisis, which is all the compounding factors that are symptoms of our modern techno-industrial way of living, which are leading ultimately to a place whereby that way of life will at some point become non-viable. So when I sort of took that perspective and migrated to New Zealand in 2010, partly in response to an understanding of that, and moving to Invercargill, where we have a relatively low population density, lots of productive land, etc., reliable rainfall. I actually thought at the time, I was moving from doing sort of new buildings design to more energy auditing and energy modelling, and then got connected to a variety of, I guess, broadly environmental concerns, which ultimately led to me meeting Dougal McTavish, who was our secretary at the time. I forget exactly how we connected, but anyway, he invited me to join the committee back in about 2014, I think, and I've just basically been involved ever since. We've made a lot of submissions to government, most of which seem to have been roundly ignored, about some of the extant risks that we face and the growing nature of those risks, and now here we are.
You've recently written a paper called "The Limits to Energy Transformation." In other words, transforming from carbon to less or non-carbon energy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you summarize some of the issues you talked about in the paper?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of the basic observations, which is a thing that I think makes a lot of sense when you come from a sort of technical background, like the sort of, energy systems and building physics and so on background, which I was trained in, but which isn't apparent to people who don't necessarily have that background, is just the primacy of energy as a enabler of GDP activity. So what I mean by that is, typically people are taught to think about the economy as a financial system which uses energy, whereas my reframing of that in the paper, what I'm trying to argue is that it's actually an energy system which happens to use money. Now, the specifics of that, there's a lot of detail, but just to give you a bit of an overview of this, we have built a economy off the back, a growth economy off the back of a one-time inheritance of a finite and depleting resource, our fossil fuel base. So the coal that we started leveraging at the start of the Industrial Revolution with the steam engine and so on, and then we moved to liquid fuels and gas supply through the 20th century. All of those have a very high energy return for the energy you put into getting them. So, you can think of it in a number of ways. Energy density is probably a simple way to think of it. Density, you can see that a litre of water is a lot more dense than a litre of flour or something. It weighs less. In energy terms, a litre of water is a lot less dense than a litre of diesel, in that it probably has the same amount of sort of inherent energy in it, but its ability to do useful work for us is vastly different, because the energy that's needed to deconstruct the hydrogen-oxygen bonds in the water is far greater than the energy needs to take the hydrocarbons in the diesel and utilize those to do useful work for us. So that's the main message, is that, our energy system is based on a depleting resource which has massive benefits and became almost like obligate, is the phrase that a chap called Nate Hagans, who talks a lot about this, uses. From a competitive advantage perspective, it wasn't really optional for economies and nations to not take up the advantage that fossil fuels gave us because of the energy advantage. And so over the last 100 years, more and more parts of the world have become industrialized, and more parts of the world have leveraged this one-time inheritance to raise standards of living, increase our ability to manipulate the physical environment around us, be that the built environment in urban areas or, the rural landscape. One farmer can do with a tractor and a ute and a few other targeted tools what it took, potentially a couple of dozen people and a few shire horses to do in days gone by. And so, just the physical input that energy gives us is something that people don't often understand. And I'll give you an example of that. So New Zealand uses something in the region, and the exact number's not really important, something in the region of about 130,000 barrels of oil equivalent of energy, of oil per day. So that's each of those barrels of oil, which, remember, historically has cost something in the region of sort of $20 to $50, spiking up to maybe $120 for short periods of time. Each of those barrels of oil does the physical work of 4.5 years of human labor. So if we're using 130,000 barrels a day, that's the equivalent of around 500,000 years of human labor per day that New Zealand is leveraging in our current economy. So that's a massive amount of energy that we're leveraging. And that gives us a huge advantage in terms of our ability to have impact on the natural world and so on. But it's fundamentally unsustainable.
We should keep in mind the word impact, I think.
Yeah.
Isn't oil and coal, aren't they actually stored energy from the sun?
Correct, yes. You can think of them as fossilized sunlight.
And when you're talking about alternative energy, that that's a meaningful thing to keep in mind, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the difference when we're talking about the fossilized sunlight is you can think of it like charging a battery. And, if you're using a battery and a torch or something, the rate at which you use it, if you want to keep using it, you'd have to plug a charger into the torch. And if the energy that you're expending creating the light with the torch is going out of the torch higher than the rate at which you can recharge that battery, then the battery drains and ultimately depletes. And so in terms of our one-time inheritance of this fossil fuel, this fossilized sunlight, which has been stored by biological systems on the Earth over millions and millions of years, we are drawing down that inheritance at a rate that is literally 1 million times faster than it's replaced. So
it isn't just that we're running. It isn't just that we've got peak oil, and then we're running out of oil and coal, is it? The effects of using oil and coal affect the environment much more than, say, if we were using wind energy or solar energy, because they all have their effect. Industrialization has its effect on nature. I'm not denying that.
That's right, and I think that is an important thing to recognise, is that there is debate around this. The question that's been asked by sorry, can you hear me there?
Yes, fine.
By a lot of people is is the environmental impact of fossil fuels actually greater than the environmental impact of all of these wind turbines and solar panels and so on that we're supposedly replacing it with, and that discussion is most often framed around this basic question of this underlying assumption, which we don't often talk about, which is that we're trying to get a like-for-like replacement. So the idea is we've grown this fossil-fueled civilization up to this size, and now we're going to transition that entire civilization over to renewable energy and keep going with this current level of expenditure. And at that scale, the scale of the machines in terms of wind and solar and so on that are required, even accounting for the inherent efficiency of using electrical energy because it has much higher, what's known as exergy, ability to do useful work for us, we'd have to have a vastly larger resource input to build all the machines to allow us to power a civilization of the same sort of scale and energy throughput using these renewable energy systems. So, it's true that I think we should be pushing into renewables. I'm for electrification of strategic electrification of parts of the economy, but a lot of the conversation that I tend to get dragged into starts with that basic assumption that we're trying to replace like for like, and we're trying to keep a growth economy. And I don't believe that that is possible. And I go into the reasons, like, some of the stuff that we've already talked about in terms of the depleting resources, the declining quality of those resources over time, because we pick the low-hanging fruits first, and therefore the increasing energy required to get those resources out. So it becomes more environmentally messy to get those resources to build replacements at this point, because we've used all of the easy to access copper, etc. Does that make sense?
Yes, and haven't there been studies that show that the countries that have switched to a large degree to solar and wind energy, alternative energy, their use of carbon and burning of carbon has still gone up because of the growth of these economies. That's right. It's the fact that we don't just grow gradually in our economy. It tends to quadruple.
Yeah, that's right. That is a real effect. It's sometimes known as Jevons paradox, or the rebound or backfire effect, depending on which school of economics you've been indoctrinated into. But basically what it says is that increases in efficiency, rather than being taken as a reduction in the amount of inputs that are required, are instead taken as productivity gains to drive growth. And so, the idea of a 4-hour working week or that sort of thing, or even just a 4-day working week would be nice, wouldn't it? Which was, the idea that technology would allow us to have more leisure time has proven false, because actually because of the nature of our economic system and the way that is set up to demand growth, and actually our financial system is reliant on capital plus interest being paid, then that actually leads to a situation where you can't really just sit on your laurels and take the efficiency gains from technological improvements and use that to have a more comfortable life. It just doesn't work like that in the real world, in inverted commas. So, the world of techno-industrial society, and the demand and the financial obligation actually on organizations to seek returns for their shareholders.
Maybe that obligation isn't unethical.
I think that's a reasonable line of thinking, actually. I think the ethics of it are contested, and ethics in themselves are not a static thing. But when you talk about it from a civilizational or even, biosphere sort of ecological perspective, it's pretty clear that the requirements around a return and increased growth and so on will ultimately consume the host.
Frankly,
and,
I don't think it's
likened it to cancer.
I don't think it's new. My grandfather was a miner.
Yes.
This was in 1914.
Okay.
And he was at Ludlow, Colorado.
Right.
And in Ludlow, Colorado, the miners went on strike.
Okay.
And the owner, Bockfellow, thought that it was his ethical right to fight the strike and to get as much profit from that coal mine as possible. And the miners were taken out of their houses, which were owned by the company. They set up at Tent City. And when the miners went to the railhead to try to stop the scabs, the sheriff's office weren't doing enough to suit the governor, so he'd called in the militia, and they surrounded the village of tents and fired artillery and machine guns into those tents.
Wow.
And between 60 and 80 people were killed during that strike. Yeah. So I question the ethics of profit as the maximum thing you think about when you're running a business. There are other important issues.
I totally agree, and that's a really great personal example. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, the impacts of these things are often externalized to us in Western society, because as Vinay Gupta, who's a futurist who I really admire, said about 10, 15 years ago, we live in militarized bubbles of prosperity. And, who are we to demand a certain material level of existence at the expense of the rest of the world's human and non-human populations, Yeah, it's a really important point. And I think it's really important to share stories like that, because, that's something that happens that people can't, sort of disagree with. It's a historical fact that you've an experience that you've had.
Shouldn't we be thinking of how we can have a good society without growth?
Yes, fundamentally, that is one of the major questions. Is how do we actually get away from the growth imperative? And there have been lots of different takes on this over the last 50, 60 years and before. I think that the latest term which has risen to prominence, which I think is a useful term because it's somewhat incorruptible, is degrowth, because it just says it straight out. This is the aim of what we're trying to achieve, and degrowth is really a narrative that says we recognise the constraints, both in terms of planetary boundaries, those ecological lines that we shouldn't cross, but also in terms of the resource depletion side of things, and that ultimately where we need to head is to a place where we're having a conversation about either we respect those boundaries and we plan an economic contraction to get back within those boundaries, because we are in a state of ecological overshoot. We've gone past those boundaries and we need to come back inside it, or we wait for the planet to do that for us, because, there are no jobs on a dead planet. And, that might be an extreme statement in some regards, but it's a logical conclusion. We are reliant entirely on the biosphere and the function of ecosystems within it in order to have life on this planet. And if we continue in our direction that we're currently heading, then clearly there are some questions about whether that is actually ultimately going to fail us and lead to a situation where, for a variety of reasons, and there's things described in the geological record about biological events that happen, or external forces, cometary impacts, volcanoes, etc., which shift the atmosphere in such a way that the type of life, complex, oxygen breathing mammalian life would not do well in, and would more than likely go extinct.
It's shocking to me that New Zealand, which has enough hydrogen power, that if we had enough solar and wind energy, we could probably use our hydrogen resources.
Yes.
As a battery. I don't know if we need a Lake Ohio type battery or not, but we're in a good position to actually follow the Paris Accord. Yet our government has decided we're not going to try to make the Paris Accord, clearly. And the agreements we had in Parliament, bipartisan agreements, have been given away or broken by the present coalition. What's your feeling about that?
Well, so hydrogen is an interesting one. Going back to my earlier comments about, needing an energy profit from our energy activities, the realities of a hydrogen economy are that the idea for green hydrogen, because it's important to recognize that there are different types of hydrogen that we could potentially leverage. Green hydrogen is the idea that you make it from surplus renewable energy. So the first part there is that you assume that you've built out renewable energy at a scale sufficient to have that surplus, which is not currently the case. Pretty much all of the energy that is available in New Zealand electrically is consumed. There's very little that is curtailed, because we already have enormous batteries in New Zealand in the hydro lakes.
Well, that's
what we do have as well is a perverse incentive in our market structure, whereby the market is driven by the price of energy is driven by the highest cost producer. And so for the energy companies trying to make a profit, they actually have an incentive to bring down those batteries to enable these higher cost gas and coal-fired energy sources to be brought online, because it's in those periods where the price of energy peaks up to $800-900 a megawatt hour that they actually really make a lot of their money through the course of the year. So we have a very structural problem in terms of our energy markets, which drives the current situation. But on the point,
I may have confused the issue because I meant hydroelectric resources.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay.
I meant
hydroelectric, yes.
And not in hydrogen. And the other thing is that it seems to me that if we'd have been doing what we could have been doing, if we'd been willing to use our taxes and to go into debt for our infrastructure, which would make sense even economically.
Yes.
Unless you're a neoliberal, which
Yes,
Unfortunately,
which is
so many
quite a
public.
lot of our policy making, elite or
Many.
governance structures or whatever you want to call them are. Yes.
If your roof is falling in and you have to
Yes.
borrow money to replace your roof or give up your house, which do you do? You borrow money to replace your roof, or you just let your roof cave in?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one as well, because as I've dived into the subject of why New Zealand doesn't actually have a very good record of spending government money, public money, for infrastructure projects in that way. If you go back to the 1989, I think it's called the Public Finance Act, then there was a constraint placed, an artificial constraint placed on the New Zealand government through legislation, which was very much a product of the neoliberal consensus of the people that wrote that legislation, which says that New Zealand cannot exercise its right to what's known as sovereign money creation. So through the Reserve Bank, national economies can create bonds and put those into the market and get a return.
And it's a lot cheaper when governments do it than when private firms do it.
Because they aren't driven by profit, right? And also it's something where the economist Steve Keen has shown quite convincingly, as far as I'm concerned, that the ability to run a public deficit is a better alternative to running a private deficit, because the nation states to some degree can't really go bankrupt in the conventional sense. And I don't want to get into too much detail because I'm not massively conversant on this issue, but my understanding is basically that the ability of nation states to print sovereign money to fund infrastructure which is recognized as needed for basic levels of well-being is something which New Zealand has specifically excluded itself from through that Public Finance Act. There's a guy called Tig Stopford on
Parliament passed it. Does that mean Parliament can't change it?
No, absolutely not. And
it's the Labour Party and the other so-called central parties has been afraid to even discuss it publicly.
Well, going back to the comment you made about neoliberals, both of our major parties, it's left wing, right wing, same bird. They're
there
both
is no
neoliberals.
left wing.
Yeah. And again, if you look at the global sort of political spectrum, you're absolutely right. That even the Greens would be seen as a centrist party in terms of global politics, and the spectrum of political opinions out there. So we are very much as a nation captured by that mindset, and it makes it very difficult to have some of the strategic conversations that we need to have around things like public money creation and so on to finance strategic spending on infrastructure, which is itself constrained by the available energy pathways which we can potentially follow into the future, and those aren't supportive of growth. So the degrowth argument in that context is the idea that basically we have to make this choice to contract and stay within these limits, because if we don't, situations like the one that we are currently heading into will force that constraint on us. And they are the energy crisis and the outcomes of that is a predictable outcome of the trajectory that we've been on as a species since since basically the dawn of agriculture. If you want to trace it right back.
Don't governments and politicians have a moral and ethical accountability to bring these issues up and discuss them so that people can make decisions about what kind of future we want?
I agree. Ideally, they do, and I'm very supportive of that position. I think the problem is that it's clear that since at least Machiavelli, there's been a recognition that you can lead a society in a different direction with certain strategic mind worms, if you like, cultural narratives which take us away from even discussing some of these things.
The result is people like Trump running things, or Musk.
Right. Yes. Absolutely. And you know, again, you know, those sorts of people. I mean, you know, you can critique them at an individual level, but actually, I'm more interested in the sort of systemic.
But don't certain systematic setups actually encourage a certain type of person and a certain mindset?
Yes, right. Yeah. Absolutely. You know, I mean, it's well known. I think, well, maybe not well known, but it seems to be reasonably well established in the scientific literature that, for example, progress up the corporate ladder to, you know, be a CEO or so on requires a certain degree of psychopathy, and that actually psychopaths are. And sociopaths are disproportionately represented at the higher levels within our society.
Speaking of energy, what do you think about the data grid's proposed Southland data center? Can you talk about the energy the data centers use from Google on down, both and the carbon they put out?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting and really important question. I actually went to Environment Southland, the regional council who's consented that data centre last week, and gave a presentation to them, which is again up on my Substack. There's a letter to council there, and there's a link to the YouTube recording of the session. In that presentation, excuse me, the major points I was making are that the grid operator itself, as in its submission to MB on this data center proposal, said that, well, kind of we don't really have 280 megawatts of spare capacity at the moment, which is phase one of this data center. It's all up. Consumption theoretically is going to go up to a gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts. But just this phase one, this 280 megawatts, we kind of don't really have this. And we've seen this. This is a playbook from the data center spread across the continental United States, because what's happened there is, it's really obvious that there isn't enough grid infrastructure to support this. So what they've done is they've built these data centers, and then they've put in place massive gas turbines, diesel generators, etc., and they're primarily running on those. And what I said to Environment Southland last week, because this was a non-notified consent, so people didn't actually have the chance to make submissions on it, is I don't know quite what your consent process looks like, but haven't you realized that the grid operator is saying the power isn't there? The data grid guys have stated very clearly in their document that they have this emergency backup diesel generation system, and that actually if you can't connect them to the grid at the day that they want to start running, they'll just start running on diesel. And has anyone looked at the air quality implications, the fallout of all of the diesel soot and so on over the wider landscape, the water take from the aquifers? I don't know, because I hadn't had time to really dig into this. What's the water allocation in the aquifer around the Makarewa area where the data center is proposed, and is that currently over allocated? Is there actually enough for them to take? I think it's 410 cubic meters of water per hour when the data center is running in adiabatic cooling mode. So there's two modes that these data centers run in. One is sort of what's known as dry cooling, whereby the ambient air temperature is low enough to pass across the heat exchangers and cool the data center. And then the other one is this adiabatic mode, where you actually have to spray water onto well, not quite the coils, but for the sake of simplicity, the coils, in order to cool the air somewhat through evaporation, so it can continue to cool the data center once the temperature gets above a certain level. So from my estimates, and I did a quick estimate on this, and remember, this is my day job, if you like, this is what I do professionally, it seems like the data center will be running for something like 500 to 1,000 hours a year on adiabatic cooling. So for that, say, 1,000 hours a year, that's 400 cubic meters of water per hour, multiplied by 1,000 is 400,000 cubic meters of water per annum, roughly potential water take from the Makarewa aquifer. And has anyone modelled that? I don't know. I mean, it may not be a massive take relative to some of the irrigation users and so on, but that question needs to be answered publicly, and I don't think anybody has at this point. And then also, there's concerns around, the use of AI in a more general sense, and reliance on it. I mean, I use it professionally to some extent. It's a very useful tool for certain tasks and so on. But I think, we have to, again, just put this in the context of the broader picture and where we are. I ended up by saying to the council last week that, you may think that this data center is the biggest piece of news that you've had in the last 3 months. I guarantee you this fuel supply constraint and potential and probable fuel supply disruption and outright rationing situation that we're heading into is a bigger problem for you right now than this data center.
Now, this data center, is it on the fast track?
I believe it might have been consented through that fast track process. I must admit, I don't actually know for sure whether it was or not. All I know is that at the regional level, where you'd expect a large thing like that to be a publicly notified consent, it wasn't a notified consenting process. So,
is Wise Response doing anything to make this more public?
Yes, so I mean, I've published, on my own personal Substack around this. Wise Response hasn't really taken a position specifically on this issue because at this point we're much more focused on the fuel supply crisis because we believe that's going to have a much bigger immediate impact, and it's something that, because of the thinking that we've done over the last 15 years or so, we've got quite a lot to say on, because there's a whole load of things that are indicated as better approaches to this, which we're trying to communicate at the moment. But yeah, I mean, over time, undoubtedly, it's something that we'll probably wade into at some point.
Why do economists decouple wealth from energy use, and are they
because
mistaken?
Of that fundamental mistake that they've made, which says that the economy is a financial system which uses energy, which happens to use energy, rather than the truth, the underlying reality, which is it is an energy system which happens to use money as a means of exchange. And because of that, they can't see the impact. So I actually used an example in my white paper where I was talking about another piece of research which Steve Keen did, and he used something. So Steve Keen is a heterodox economist. He's a professor of economics. He's been involved with a number of prestigious universities around the world, and is the originator of a dynamic systems dynamics model that he uses for energy. For economic modeling, called not Minsky. It used to be called Minsky. Ravel or Ravel. I can't remember how to pronounce it. But anyway, he's a very credible heterodox economist. He's sort of, not a mainstream economist because of his. He falls outside of the neoliberal lockstep that a lot of economists are into. And what he says, he did this piece of work on the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is a workhorse of the neoclassical macroeconomic modeling process. And that production function treats output as a product of labor and capital. So that is to say, when you're modeling economic output, the only things that you need as inputs and factors to explain it are labor and capital. And where energy is included at all, it enters as a third independent factor with an exponent derived from its cost share of GDP. So roughly 0.03 to 0.05, 3 to 5%, that is. Under this treatment, a 10% fall in energy supply would reduce output by only 0.3 to 0.4%. And this is the framework underpinning most government and central bank modelling of energy shocks. So this is why I'm so concerned at the moment about the relatively sanguine, it's a problem, but, we're managing it, we're monitoring the situation. Whereas, I was out on the block 3 weeks ago saying, start rationing now. You don't understand. This is 20% of global oil supply, actually 40% of traded global energy supply. When you look oil supply, when you look at the amount that's consumed in countries that produce it, this is a massive amount of energy to suddenly go missing from the global economy. And where, this amount of energy might be seen to be, by these economic models, only a few basis points, they call them, a few tenths or hundredths of a percent change in the economic output. I think we're going to see a much bigger effect than that, and that's just with the price rises that we've currently experienced, where I believe we're heading based on the current escalations in the Middle East and the data and reporting that's coming out about the Asian refineries where we source our refined products from, is an outright shortage of oils. And without diesel, the New Zealand economy grinds very quickly to a complete standstill. It is the workhorse of our economy, and we cannot run the economy in its current form without it. And so that's where my sort of earlier communications with the government were, and now I'm trying to say, well, okay, if the government is going to remain locked into this ideological cage, which it seems to be in, then actually what can we do as communities, as individuals, around what's known broadly as mutual aid, in order to improve outcomes at the community level in the face of this inaction at the strategic level by the central government.
Well, what do you suggest we do?
Well, it's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. So again, on the Wise Response Substack, which is wiseresponse.substack.com, we put up an article on the 20th of March, so 4 days ago, titled, "What Can I Do in Response to the Fuel Supply Crisis in Aotearoa, New Zealand?" And at the time of writing, we have 20 to 27 days of physical onshore fuel stocks. Government will do whatever government's going to do. And so we wrote a guide, and the guide is available from the article. It's a live Google document, and we've encouraged and invited people to come in. It's open for comments, so you can log into the document and actually add your own considered, please, thoughts around what practical things, additionally to what we've already got in there, we could do. But it has 10 main areas, so food production, water, energy, transport and mobility, health and medical, economic mutual aid, communication and coordination, governance and decision making, our vulnerable populations, and then what to do this week. So those are the 10 broad areas, and within each of those areas we've linked to guidance that we've found over the years, which has been shown in countries where we have already a significant shock around fuel supply, places like Cuba, which back at the collapse of the Soviet Union went through what they call the special period, where they lost something like 50% of their energy supply for a period of years, and they had to really think very hard about how they reconfigured their society in order to respond well to that. And a lot of urban agriculture, so that the production of food was closer to the people who needed to eat it, and a whole lot of other measures. Thankfully for the Cubans, they had a relatively switched on governance structure, which allowed them to make these changes collectively. We're more fragmented in New Zealand. An example from the Christchurch earthquakes of a more cohesive community approach was the Littleton Time Bank, which was studied post-earthquake, and there's a paper written on how well that did and how much of a benefit to the community the time bank was. But we have lots of things that we can be getting on with, even in the face of immediate shortages. I was actually just talking this morning to another guy who you might want to have a chat to, Mike Hodgkinson, who's also Otago based, I believe, and he's part of a group called Adapt Research, and they've been writing. Their lead, Matt Boyd, did a presentation last year on. They've been doing a paper on catastrophic risk, not a paper, actually I guess you'd say a strategic investigation, looking at the potential for, in particular, nuclear risks. But actually, it's interesting whether you look at it in terms of nuclear war, some sort of large volcanic eruption that affects a large proportion of the Earth, or something like these sorts of fuel crises. Irregardless of the trigger, those are all triggers, the response, the way that we adapt to that should be the same. And what Mike is saying, and I agree with this, is at this moment, we really need to be thinking very hard about what we're going to do with the remainder of the fuel once those ships stop coming for a period of time. And let's hope it's only a short period. But, you know, from the analysis I've seen, past the sort of the beginning of April, we don't have many ships booked and confirmed coming to New Zealand with fuel. And that means that I think we're likely in the next couple of weeks to see the government reluctantly and, you know, not wanting to be a nanny state and all the other ideological positions that they've taken on this, being forced into a position where their only option is to ration. The problem is, having left it so late, we'll have less fuel to ration than we otherwise would have, so it won't go as far. So, you know, the question that Mike's was asking me this morning is like, how do we communicate that actually we need to think primarily in terms of human well-being when it comes to the allocation of the remainder of that fuel, because people must eat. And if you don't have food being delivered to people in the cities, then actually you very quickly descend into some very undesirable social situations where people become desperate and they make decisions on the basis of not having eaten for several days rather than any sort of strategic thoughts.
I was thinking about what we haven't done because diesels are a big problem first, isn't it, in some ways?
Yes, that's right.
And because we haven't electrified buses and we haven't electrified trains and we haven't increased the ability of the use of trains in New Zealand,
yes,
we're a cliff stick. I mean, we almost purposely are unprepared.
You could certainly look at it like that. I mean, you know, it's purposefully unprepared is, I think, possibly a little bit further than I would go. You know, it feels that way, but actually, you know, we've talked already.
But the governments have been irresponsible.
Yeah, I think you could say that. Successive governments over the last 30 or 40 years have failed to take seriously the sorts of risks that organisations like Wise Response have been pointing to, and have failed because of their ideological positions to prefer a particular set of supposedly strategic actions which they've taken, which are proving in this moment to be woefully inadequate for the challenges that we now face and that we've been pointing to as Wise Response and other organisations for many years.
Do you have any indications that the government is thinking about rationing?
I mean, I think that what's clear is that, you know, the National Fuel Plan that was consulted on last year and so on gives the government a bit of a steer on this. And I know that they are, I have had a little bit of connection to some ministerial officers who've indicated that there is preparation work going on behind the scenes. Clearly, that hasn't really come through yet in the communications from the sort of political figureheads, but I believe that there are plans being drawn up behind the scenes. But the question and the discussions and probably the conflict, I imagine, that's happening is between, you know, people within the ministries who have a similar sort of perspective to the ones we've been discussing, who are trying to advocate for going fast and going hard, as we did during COVID, to get better societal outcomes, and the current position that the government's taking, which is, you know, we don't want to interfere. The sacred market will provide for us. All hail the sacred market.
Okay. In the long run, what kind of how do we build a resilient society where we don't grow more? The best we can hope for is to have a society that works somewhat as this society does, but not based on growth.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is a very difficult question from where we currently are. You know, we have become so reliant on cheap, easily available, freely accessible energy that we really to some extent know no other way. Now, I mean, I'm late 40s. Clearly, you're a bit older than me. People of our generation grew up in, pre-computer era, before the personal computer and so on. But and we've had some experience of this. Even people in their 80s and 90s now were wartime babies who potentially experienced that period after the Second World War, when rationing was quite widespread throughout the Western world. So there is some societal knowledge around what it's like to live with a lot less energy, and in the sort of most optimistic view of things, we can go back to, I don't know, pick your decade, the 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, depending on how far down that energy ladder you believe we have to climb, and live at a standard which, it's more manual input because it's less energy input from fossil sources than we've had in the last 50 years. But it's not a terrible life, I mean, there were some material hardships, and a lot of people doing it hard. But I read a statistic the other day that said that a third of Kiwi households currently are running short on food. That that this is already the reality, is that this collapse scenario, this unplanned degrowth, is already upon us in many respects. And so and that's led to the rise of populist politicians like Trump. There's a real danger in New Zealand that if we don't start to have a public conversation, honestly, about some of these constraints that are phasing them, to sit with that for a while, accept that reality, and then plan accordingly, then we will be more easily swayed in the direction of the sort of populist politics of both the left and right persuasion, I might add, that might take us down some very undesirable, authoritarian, totalitarian type scenarios.
Do you think this present fuel crisis, because of the attack on Iran, which I won't discuss because that's another day,
yeah,
is this a foretaste of what we're facing in the future? Anyway.
100%. So, as Wise Response, we have been open in our submissions to the various government consultations that we've put in submissions to, and in various events that we've organised in Otago and elsewhere, saying that there are constraints. We do have limits to growth. There is a finite, constrained future that we're facing. And if we don't talk about it now, if we don't have the sorts of discussions that we've been having in this last hour, and thank you very much for giving this some airtime, then actually, the reality is that we will face an unplanned and unmanaged contraction. And it could easily be an unmanageable contraction that leads to some level of collapse of our institutions and of our broader society.
Nathan, Surendran, thank you very much for coming on. And I hope that we'll all actually think and be active about this problem, both the immediate problem of the Honduras Strait being cut and the fuel supplies being cut, but also the longer-term problem of dealing with a growth rate that our physical world can't handle.
Correct. Yeah. No, thank you very much. And again, thank you for your time, Marvin. I appreciate it.
Thank you, friends.
Very insightful question.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.